Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is October 13th, 2024, Sunday, October 13th, 2024. And our first story, like usual, is out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this is titled The Perils of Pauline. The year is 1940. The place is Rockland, Maine, and one day Alzada Pauline Young, who was only 16 years old, inexplicably disappears on Halloween Day, and despite an intensive search for her, she is not found until one day. And I'm going to interject real quickly. I decided to include this specific story because, as you know, we're just 2 weeks out from Halloween. But anyway, let's continue. The Phelps family lived in a duplex on 28 Crescent Street. Thelma Phelps, the mother, had two children by a prior marriage, Pauline, age 16, and Evangeline, age 13, who lived at the Pownell State School, where children with disabilities or behavior problems were institutionalized. She had married John Phelps, a man 20 years her senior, and had two children with him, Rachel, age 11, and Bernard, age 9. Thelma Phelps worked at City House and Almshouse, and her husband, John Phelps, 54, at the WPA, which hired unskilled labor. On Halloween Day, when Thelma Phelps arrived from work that night, she asked her husband where Pauline was. He told her he did not know, but thought that she had gone to a friend's house on Thompson Street. She told City Marshal Fish to pick her up and bring her home if he ran across her. However, in the next few days, no one saw or heard from Pauline, as she was known by her family. It seemed the earth had swallowed her up. And it turned out this was indeed quite accurate as to her actual whereabouts. The police came to the home and searched for her, but no trace was found. On November 9th, her stepfather, John Phelps, was found stumbling and bleeding profusely near the police station at 2 a.m. He tried to kill himself by taking 5-bichloride of mercury pills. When that didn't work, he slashed his left wrist with a jackknife. He was taken to Knox County Hospital, where he made a complete confession to the police after they insisted on knowing why he had tried to kill himself. The whole incident played out on the afternoon of October 31st. Phelps told authorities he had brought his stepdaughter home after she had been absent a week and found her at Albert Wilson's house. He told her he didn't want her to be gone any longer and described Pauline as unruly. He called his wife at work and she told him to keep Pauline at home. It was at this point the argument escalated between Phelps and Pauline. Phelps told his wife once she returned from work that Pauline refused to stay home and told him she was going away to be married. He asked her to stay home for supper and she replied, "To hell with supper, to hell with you, and to hell with mother." Then she ran out the back door. He explained that the younger children were not there since they were trick-or-treating. However, this version was not entirely accurate. The newspaper quoted Phelps as the following, quote, "She cursed and came at me with a butcher knife. I threw a hammer at her and it struck her on the forehead. I turned her over and she was not breathing, and I knew she was dead. I didn't know what to do with the body, but finally removed the head with an axe and a knife and carried it out to the hen pen, where I buried it. The body I dragged down the cellar stairs." He stashed the body in the cellar until the next day when his children were at school and his wife was at work. He then dismembered it into 5 or 6 pieces and buried it under the house porch. He got it under the piazza by way of a cellar window. However, Phelps' account of what happened is questionable, since the neighbors heard a woman scream 4 times, followed by a dull thud. The neighbors then described that about 7 p.m., Thelma Phelps arrived home from work, and she said to her husband 3 times, "I can't, Daddy," this being the way she addressed her husband. Ruel Westmoreland, Marion Alley, and Ruby Weeks, who occupied the other side of the house, suspected something was wrong when they saw him carrying bags between the house and the hen house, and they heard him working in the cellar. The neighbors made no report initially. However, They became suspicious when the days passed and Pauline was not seen again, and within a few days they notified authorities. Thelma Phelps told police she had not reported her daughter missing, as it appeared that it was common for Pauline to spend days away from home with friends. She told police she had been at work when the crime was committed. John Phelps suspected he would be found out eventually, which is when he attempted suicide, followed by his confession. Based on the information provided by Phelps, police found 2 bags under the porch of the house, one underneath the hen house and another under a dog house. The 5th was under a shed behind the 2-story frame structure. Digging up the shallow graves, they found her shoulder in one burlap bag, her legs in another, an arm and her chest in a 3rd bag, a thigh and her torso in another, and in the last bag was a single thigh. No head. So they checked Whitham's wharf, where it was understood the head had been thrown. The newspaper reported this spot was half a mile from the Phelps home. They dragged the harbor. Nothing. The head has never been found. Stories circulated among local kids about where it could be. Adults pondered whether Phelps was cunning enough to have hidden it somewhere undiscoverable in order to hide marks which would prove that more than one single blow was administered. There were stories of neighbors seeing him walk down a neighborhood quarry with a burlap bag. When asked what it was in it, he said it was kittens that he planned to drown. Pauline's body was buried on December 14, 1940, and disinterred for another examination in January 1941. As soon as her husband confessed, Thelma Phelps quit her job, quickly left town with her 2 children, and went to Danforth. In January 1941, she was brought back to town by the county attorney to identify Pauline's body when it was exhumed. Phelps pled innocent in municipal court in November 1940. In 1941, he had 3 indictments against him: murder, dismemberment of a human body, and abandonment of a human body. It was revealed that for a week or so before her death, Pauline had been avoiding her home and staying with a friend. Was she frightened of being alone with her stepfather? Why had John Phelps taken the trouble to go find her at her friend's house and bring her home, especially since her mother said to police it was common for Pauline to spend days away from home? Phelps went on to plead guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. In 1963, his plea for clemency was rejected. He died in 1968 at the age of 81. By 1942, Thelma Phelps had divorced the murderer of her daughter and married her 3rd husband, Frederick Mailman. It seems that Thelma had a streak of bad luck when it came to the children from her first marriage to Lowell Young. They married in 1921, and she gave birth to Shirley Bell Young on June 6, 1922. The child died 3 days later. She gave birth to Alzada Pauline in 1924 and Evangeline in 1927. Neither of these births were registered. Thelma sought a divorce from Lowell Young on September 10, 1929, on the grounds of cruel and abusive treatment and non-support. She married John Phelps a month later. Pauline had been sent off to live with her maternal grandparents. When she joined her mother and stepfather is unknown. Thelma's other daughter, Evangeline, was institutionalized at a young age at Pownell State School, as it was known then. Later it became Pinelands. Originally it was the main school for the feeble-minded. In order to hide her identity, she was registered as Evangeline Phelps. The existence of Evangeline came to light when John Lowell murdered her sister, and mention was made of her in the newspapers. Evangeline died in 1947 at the age of 19. John Phelps himself didn't seem to have good luck with his marriages either. He married Bertha Trott in 1903 when he was only 16 years old, but it was short-lived, and he married Eunice Bellier in 1908. This marriage produced at least 6 children, possibly more, and then he married Thelma York Lowell in 1929. Thelma died in 1994 at the age of 87. She had outlived everyone. After the gruesome murder, the duplex on Crescent Street developed a reputation for being haunted. The fact that Pauline's head was never found caused rumors to swirl that it was still somewhere on the grounds or beneath the house. So there you go. Was it the way he said? An unruly teenager who gave lip and he threw a hammer at her and killed her? Or did he go get her for want her in the house for other reasons? And the reason why he cut off her head and nobody ever found the head was like some of the neighbors were wondering, was that going to prove that it was not accidental? Even though he was, still convicted regardless. But I don't know. I'm not sure if at that time if there was a death penalty in Maine, maybe that would have made the difference if they would have found the head and they would have seen that it was not an accident. I don't know, back in the 1940s. But what was happening with capital punishment there? Anyway, next story again is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled The Question of Our Origins. The ability to map a person's DNA is popular to verify your ancestors, but what if your actual roots turn out not to be what you've been told for years, but somewhere totally different? The evolution of man has for many years been tied to the search for the supposed missing link. However, this theory has come under scrutiny in recent years, starting with the supposed 6 million years that it took for humans and chimps to evolve from the same ancestor, which is too short a time for this divergence to take place. The dates of fossil skulls, previously hailed as exact, were later disregarded. Other proofs used for the out of Africa model, or OOAM, of human evolution is not as ironclad as once thought. Many of these challenges stem from recent scientific papers on the human genome, mitochondrial DNA, and Y chromosomes. OOAM, also referred to as the African replacement model, argues that modern human, Homo sapiens, evolved in East Africa about 200,000 years ago. Then, about 120,000 years ago, these modern humans started to spread throughout the world. The main exodus from Africa is dated to about 70,000 years ago. They allegedly replaced less advanced humans such as Neanderthals in Asia, Europe, and the Old World. This was supposed to have happened with little or no interbreeding. The alternative to OOAM is multi-regionalism, which argues that ancestors of modern-day human groups are human, Homo erectus, which left Africa about 2 million years ago. They settled roughly where they are today, evolving throughout different regions. There was, however, interbreeding between these groups. Greg Jeffries, an Australian historian, explains that, quote, the whole out of Africa myth has its roots in the mainstream academic campaign in the 1990s to remove the concept of race. When I did my degree, they all spent a lot of time on the out of Africa thing, but it's been completely disproved by genetics. Mainstream still holds on to it, end quote. The academics most responsible for the OOAM theory with the common African mother named Eve were professors Alan C. Wilson and Rebecca L. Kahn. They did specify in their paper that placing Eve in Africa was just an assumption, not an assertion. In 2012, the paper titled Re-examining the Out of Africa Theory and the Origins of Europeids in the Light of DNA Genealogy confirmed the denial of any African ancestry in non-Africans. It does support the existence of a common ancestor, but this individual would not necessarily be in Africa. In fact, it was never proved that he lived in Africa. Examination of 7,556 haplogroups resulted in the absence of any African genes. The researcher stated, quote, the findings that the Europoid haplogroup did not descend from African haplogroups A or B is supported by the fact that bearers of the Europoid, as well as all non-African groups, do not carry either SNIs, MP91, P97, M31, P82, M23, M114, and P262. End quote. Their theory maintains that non-Africans and current Africans descended separately from a more ancient common ancestor. Also, the OOAM proposed that there was little, if any, interbreeding between groups, which has been challenged by evidence from ancient DNA. Modern humans and other human groups such as Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred, proving they are the same species. A report issued in 2017 using evolutionary dating found that mitochondrial DNA taken from a Neanderthal thigh bone from 124,000 years ago indicated that African DNA mitochondrial DNA, genes were found in Neanderthals, but over 270,000 years ago. This puts modern humans in or near Europe long before they left Africa or before they even evolved there. A Homo sapien skull found in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, originally dated at 160,000 years ago, was reevaluated to be from 315,000 years ago. This means humans appeared in Africa 100,000 years earlier than thought, and in North Africa, not East Africa. Previously, the earliest modern human fossils found outside of Africa were dated to 90,000 to 100,000 years ago. The human species has been found to contain at least 20% DNA from other hominids, such as Neanderthal, Denisovan, African Archaic, Homo erectus, and now possibly Hobbit or Homo florensis. It might be as high as 40%, but has not yet been identified. Modern humans are the only one who survived, and their closest extinct relatives were the Neanderthals, who lived in Europe and Asia until they were extinct about 40,000 years ago. However, the divergence from Neanderthals to modern humans happened about 550,000 to 765,000 years ago. About 1.5 to 2.1% of the DNA of anyone outside Africa is Neanderthal in origin. Humanity, genetically speaking, is a hybrid species that did not share the same hunter-gatherer ancestry in Africa. And I think that, the work that they're doing now with DNA sequencing, it's a lot of these old theories are going to have to put them by the wayside. I did my pie chart. I'm 3% Neanderthal. Okay? So that theory that they had that there was no interbreeding between these different species of humans shows that not quite. So, and they're thinking that there might have been interbreeding even with other types of humans that obviously died out. But I think that a lot of, like I said, a lot of these old theories with the study of DNAs, they're going to have to like either revise it or just totally throw it out. Okay, let's see. Next story is out of Atlas Obscura, and is titled The Enduring Mystery of the Loretto Chapel Staircase. It's considered a miracle, an engineering marvel, and even a scientific anomaly, depending on who you ask. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, the helix-shaped spiral staircase at Loretto Chapel has long puzzled visitors, including architects and physicists. There are several unknowns surrounding the staircase and its late 19th century origins. First off, how is a 20-foot structure, which includes two 360-degree turns, built without the use of nails or other support? And how has it never wavered despite so much use after all these years? Also unknown is the type of wood used to build the staircase, and who built it in the first place. Neither the carpenter nor their materials have ever been identified. Over the years, multiple historians, and more recently internet sleuths, have scoured historical records and other resources in various attempts to solve the mystery, with little agreement between them. There are numerous conflicting theories, and the staircase's construction has been scrutinized in several books and even an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Today, roughly 250,000 visitors marvel at the chapel and its mystifying unsupported spirals each year. For some, the ongoing mystery is an answer in itself. According to chapel curator Richard Lindsley, these absences of information can only lead to one explanation: a divine miracle. People from all different fields, from faith, from science, have gravitated to it. But no one has given me truly convincing evidence, said Lindsley, who's been employed by the chapel for over 30 years. And that's why I choose to believe that prayers to St. Joseph were deeply involved. In 1872, the Sisters of Loretto, a Catholic religious order that originated in Kentucky, commissioned a chapel to be built for their girls' school in Santa Fe. The blueprint came from prominent French architect Antoine Moulet's son, Projectus. The chapel would serve as a side project while he worked on the nearby St. Francis Cathedral with his father. After 5 years of construction, the Loretto Chapel was consecrated in 1878 as an impressive Gothic revival building based on the famous Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, with spirals and buttresses constructed from locally quarried sandstone, plus stained glass windows imported from France via the Santa Fe Trail. The chapel was considered a masterpiece. That is, until everyone realized that Projectus Mouly's plans did not include access to the chapel's choir loft. Unfortunately, by that time, Mouly had met his untimely death in a shooting. His father had returned to France. The nuns called in a team of carpenters, who after a period of deliberation decided that this problem could never be solved. A staircase would not only detract from the chapel's grand design, they said it would also be impossible to build in such a small space. The only feasible way to reach the loft would be by ladder, which the nuns refused as being too inappropriate and hazardous to climb in their habits. Without alternatives, the sisters turned to what they knew best, prayer. During a novena, 9 days of consecutive prayer, to a specific saint or intention, they asked St. Joseph, the patron saint of carpenters, for an answer. Allegedly, on the 9th day, a mysterious shabby-looking man arrived with a donkey and a toolbox, offering his services. Over the next few months, he made the staircase for the chapel, requesting only complete privacy and several tubs of hot water for the duration. When it was finished, he left suddenly without taking payment. Of course, the sisters were flummoxed to see the results. A sleek, beautiful staircase comprising 33 steps, 33 being the age at which Jesus was crucified, held together with only wooden pegs, no nails. Even more incredulously, the wood it was made of certainly did not come from New Mexico. After searching for the man and never finding him, they concluded that the Loretto chapel staircase must have been built by St. Joseph himself. To this day, no one knows who built the staircase. Whoever he was, decades of experts have confirmed that he must have been a woodworking master to create a staircase comprising two tightly coiled 360-degree turns free of centering support. According to Reba Weatherford, an archivist at the Loretto Heritage Center in Kentucky, dozens of people have written to the order over the years claiming that a relative of theirs had been the unknown man. One writes, "My grandfather, J. H. Rogers, disappeared from Omaha, Nebraska in 1881. When he arrived in Santa Fe, he heard about the need for the stairway, and he decided to build the stairway as an atonement for his sins of drinking. That could be the reason for not staying around after it was built to receive any money." This letter is just one story of many. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were a lot of these, Weatherford says. The most popular theory about the carpenter's identity has come from Santa Fe historian Mary J. Straw Cook in her 1984 book Loretto, The Sisters and Their Santa Fe Chapel. She posits that the builder was Francois Jean Frenchy Rochas, citing an 1895 newspaper article about the murder of the reclusive rancher. The article describes Rochas as an expert worker in wood and claimed he was the man behind the Loretto Chapel staircase. Cook backed up her claim with an 1881 logbook memo for a $150 check paid for wood Mr. Rochas for N School. Many familiar with the staircase mystery aren't satisfied with this theory, however, as the payment was 3 years after the staircase's supposed completion, and at that time the sisters had indeed also commissioned the building of a nearby school. Loretto archivist Weatherford adds, "The newspaper clipping has been referenced a lot, that's for sure, but it does not exist in our records. I don't know where it exists." Unfortunately, many such historical records pertaining to the staircase have been hard to find. Some were lost over the years, and the moving of archival records between convents, or burned in several fires that destroyed the schools and convent buildings throughout New Mexico missions in the late 19th and early to mid-20th centuries. The staircase's design was ingenious for its era, even more so considering how it was made to stay up using only basic hand tools and no electricity. Over the years, the staircase also endured regular use. A 1959 archival photo shows a 20-strong women's choir assembled on its steps, though these days its access is firmly closed to the public. Lindsley, the curator, says he's spoken to architects who can't explain the staircase durability. Every carpenter I've ever met has been amazed. Lindsley says he recalls many stories of scientists and tradespeople visiting the chapel, like the staircase builder from Arizona, who once spent 8 hours intensely inspecting the staircase. I was impressed by his wife, who was there and waiting for him the whole time, he laughs. A puzzling detail exists, though. Despite being such a master craftsman, the staircase builder did leave out one thing: a hand railing to keep the steps from shaking when stepped on. The twisted stairs, like a giant spring, were known to have a serious bounce. After a decade, a railing was added, when supposedly the nuns grew tired of crawling down on their hands and knees to prevent tripping. Indeed, it's strange that a narrow spiral staircase, intended for nuns in traditional robes, wouldn't come with hand support in the first place. Experts have determined that the staircase is made of spruce wood, but it's unclear where the wood came from. It certainly did not come from local lumber yards. Recently, the wood's inconclusive origins have become what many consider to be an absolute indication that Loretto's chapel staircase was a divine act. In 1996, Forrest N. Easley, a retired forester and wood technologist for the U.S. Forest Service, also formerly of the U.S. Navy Research and Development Laboratory, studied the staircase for 15 months. He concluded in a study that no spruce existed in the world exactly like it, even suggesting that the wood was so unique that it should be named Loretto spruce. The Loretto Chapel was actively used every day by the students and nuns of the Loretto Academy's girls' school until it closed in 1968. Today it functions as a privately owned museum, visited by everyone from Catholic pilgrims to school groups. It's also a popular wedding venue. The Loretto Heritage Center archives highlights the staircase mystery's impact over the years. This impact can be seen in a film made about the staircase, as well as songs, a comic book, and a children's book, which archivist Reba Weatherford has blogged about. Each year, she says, the center receives a handful of information requests from curious documentarians and filmmakers. She says the sisters are too busy focusing on the Loretto community's mission to work for justice and act for peace, to pay much attention to the staircase's fame. Instead, they simply enjoy the miracle and mystery. It's interesting to have this instance of religious history colliding with pop culture, she explains. Especially from an archival perspective, it's fun since the bulk of what we get are genealogy requests. Even after 30 years as curator, Richard Lindsley continues to welcome anyone to try to change his mind that the Loretto Chapel staircase is anything but a miracle. I'm always asked my opinion, and I have to believe it's a miracle, he says, and I'll find out the details on the other side. Very interesting. Very interesting. You know, nobody can explain the mechanics of it, how it was built, and nobody can find the wood. One thing that's kind of creepy is two people that might have been involved with it got killed. The original architect of the church and the other man that they were saying that might have been the one to do it. That's a little bit eerie, but yeah, there you go. Okay, getting back to stranger than fiction stories. This next story is titled "The Reality of Demonic Possession." The belief in evil spirits and demons have been part of human history from time immemorial. However, in recent times, this phenomena has spiked worldwide, and according to certain sources, there is a reason for this increase. Demonic possession is thought by many to be a holdover from when superstition held sway over the public. However, there are those, not only clergy or religious figures, but medically trained persons who believe there is some validity to these claims. One of them is Dr. Richard Gallagher, a psychiatrist and professor at New York Medical College and Columbia University. However, there is another side to his practice, which is to determine if a person is suffering from mental illness or a possible possession. The Vatican has recognized that the demand for exorcism has risen in recent years. They tied this into the decline of belief in Christian values and the ease in which the public can find information about black magic, the occult, and Satanism via the internet. In 2018, Dr. Gallagher wrote a book titled Demonic Foes, a psychiatrist investigates demonic possession in the modern United States based on 25 years of his practice. He stressed there is a strict criteria for determining what is wrong with the person who has been referred for an evaluation, and it's all based on a scientific point of view. He said that spirit possession is rare, but real. He cited that about 75% of Americans believe in the devil, and half of them believe in demonic possession. Belief in dark beings varies from country to country. In Madagascar, 100% of the population believes in spirit possession. Haiti is another country which believes in demons, and part of the religious practice called voodoo incorporates spirit possession. Dr. Gallagher has always been a practicing Catholic, but at one time he was doubtful of the existence of demonic possession. Early in his medical career, two prominent exorcists referred cases to him that ultimately convinced him of the reality of this ancient belief system. One of these cases involved a woman given the pseudonym of Julia. She was a priestess in a satanic cult. The crux of her problem was whether she would leave the group so that the exorcism would be successful. Dr. Gallagher's role in the case was to speak to her about her anxieties and lingering ties to the cult. She believed that after joining the cult she developed paranormal abilities and that Satan favored her with what she asked for. On another occasion, she demonstrated the ability to remote view. She told Dr. Gallagher, quote, "We really hate Father Blank and have to keep an eye on him," end quote. The priest was one who worked on the exorcism team. He lived in another part of the United States. And at that moment, she said, he's walking along a beach in his blue windbreaker and khaki pants, and he's saying prayers. Dr. Gallagher called him immediately and confirmed everything Julie had described. The priest said normally he would be in the rectory, but on this day he decided to walk on the beach to say his breviary. Going into trance is a hallmark of a person that's been possessed. They rarely remember what happened during the trance. Several times Julia spoke to Dr. Gallagher in a demonic voice that said, "Leave her alone, you effing priest, you monkey priest, she's ours." The diatribe would continue for 5 minutes, and when she came out of it, she couldn't remember anything. Dr. Gallagher once heard the same strange voice break into a telephone conversation he was having with one of the priests on the exorcism team. This was at a time when Julia was thousands of miles away from his office. The nature of the conversation involved a scheduling conflict where he couldn't attend the next exorcism. The voice stated, "We told you she's ours, you leave her alone." The priest also heard the voice. Julia had several fears. She was afraid of the satanic cult if she left, but believed she was no longer the leader's favorite because she was aging. Excuse me. She was also afraid of being diagnosed as crazy and being institutionalized. Multiple exorcisms were performed, but they failed because she would not leave the cult. A year later, she called one of the priests and said she wanted to resume the exorcisms because she had been diagnosed with cancer and did not want to die possessed. Once the priest told her that Dr. Gallagher would have to evaluate her again, including the report from her oncologist, she told him she had to think about it. The team never heard from her again, and it was presumed she died. Dr. Gallagher also specifies that a person could be suffering from seizure disorders, epilepsy, be psychotic, or having auditory hallucinations. Others that are suffering from delusions, claiming they are possessed, could be bipolar, schizophrenic, or be under the influence of drugs. Persons with multiple personality disorder, or MPD, might have an evil alter ego, which could be misconstrued by demonic fundamentalist people. It takes several meetings between the person and Dr. Gallagher as he gathers information about them and their background. Were they involved in the occult or in a dark ritual including Satanism? There is no other criteria used to evaluate for possession, such as the ability to speak in languages. The person does not know. The ability to speak in languages the person does not know. Abnormal strength, a paranormal ability, and knowledge of secret things. It's not only Catholic clergy who send people to Dr. Gallagher, but others from different faiths. In the case of Julia, she told Dr. Gallagher how his mother had died, something he knew she had not prior knowledge of. During 25 years, Dr. Gallagher directly observed 100 full-blown possessions and attended hundreds of other exorcisms that were not his patients. However, he only attended exorcism where the team knew what they were doing. In the United States, a person must sign a legal form agreeing to the ritual. He's observed a comparison to his experiences when interviewing terrorists and criminals committed to evil. Asked if he's afraid, he says he has people praying for him when he's attending an exorcism and that he knows he's on the winning side. Dr. Gallagher described when during an exorcism, a priest was reciting prayers in Latin and the possessed woman was sarcastically commenting on it. The woman was not Catholic at that time and had an education equivalent to a 14-year-old. Dr. Gallagher believes that demons have been observing human beings since the beginning of time. He said, "They're very, very smart. The intelligence level of a fallen angel, which is what I call them, is far superior to human beings, which is why they denigrate human beings. They sometimes call us monkeys." Yep. See, as a matter of fact, I read his book. It was very, very good book. Very good book. Well written, not, not over the top, you know. You could tell, in other words, that he was very measured in what he was describing. It's a very good book. Okay, next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this is titled The Danger of Germ Warfare. Sometimes known as bioterrorism, these weapons involve infectious agents and toxins. These can include fungi, viruses, and bacteria, and depending on their characteristics can kill human, animal, and or plant life. The qualities that make germ warfare lethal and effective are the ones that make them unpredictable. We're talking about non-human living organisms that are resilient and can be used as weapons, but are dangerously difficult to control. These organisms do not respect treaties or borders between countries, or for that matter, continents. Even ancient civilizations understood how effective biological warfare was to bring an enemy to their knees. 500 years before the birth of Christ, Assyrians contaminated their enemies' wells with rye ergot fungus. This fungus contains chemicals related to LSD. They knew it was inevitable that water would be ingested, and that it produced confused mental states, hallucinations, and even death. In 1334, a plague blossomed in China, where 5 million people died. This amounted to two-thirds of China's population. It was carried along trade routes and made its way west, hitting Mesopotamia, Syria, and India. In 1343, Mongol warriors known as Tartars, led by Johnny Beg of the Golden Horde, lay siege against Kaffa, a Genoese cathedral city and a port central to the trade industry located on the Crimean peninsula of the Black Sea. The Tartars turned their own misfortune into a weapon by flinging infected bodies of their own dead over the city walls using catapults. These warriors had died from the plague. The rotting bodies poisoned the water supply, causing death among the city's inhabitants, despite being quickly dumped into the sea. Hoping to escape the plague, 4 ships sailed from Kaffa to Italy. The ships brought the disease to Venice, and from there it spread to Italy and the rest of Europe. Known as the Black Death, it's impacted European history and killed over 25 million people. Genome sequencing has found the origins of the Black Death started in China over 2,000 years ago. The plague, or Yersinia pestis, is a gram-negative coccobacillus. It is a zoonotic disease, meaning it can be transmitted from animals to humans and vice versa. There are 3 primary forms: bubonic plague, septicemic plague, and pneumonic plague. It was discovered in 1894 by Alexander Yersin in Kitasato, Shibasa Borough during the Hong Kong plague epidemic. It was later found to be transmitted via the bite of a flea that has fed on infected rodents. According to Dr. Friedrich Freixnecht, a professor at Heidelberg University, Germany, the Japanese army poisoned more than 1,000 water wells in Chinese villages to study cholera and typhus outbreaks. Some of the epidemics they caused persisted for years and continued to kill more than 30,000 people in 1947, long after the Japanese had surrendered. During World War II, nations involved looking into developing anthrax spores, brucellosis, and botulism toxins. Thankfully, the Allies never used them. The Japanese, though, did drop ceramic bombs full of bubonic infected fleas on Ningbo, China. Bioterrorism can be implemented with aerosol sprays, explosives, or intentional contamination of food and water supplies. Some pathogens are hardier than others, and this determines how it will be deployed. Unfortunately, this type of warfare holds an appeal for terrorists as it is low tech to produce and distribute. Since there is a delay in contamination, it allows the perpetrator time to escape. In a battlefield scenario, military personnel from both sides can be infected. Present day, most experts believe that the organisms that causes anthrax would be used in a bioterrorism attack. It is easily found in nature or can be reproduced in a laboratory. It is versatile in the ways it can be spread, and it survives a long time in different environments. In 2001, anthrax spores were sent through the postal system. 5 of 22 people infected died. The person who sent it was never caught. Smallpox, unlike anthrax, can be transmitted from one person to another. Due to vaccination efforts, it has mostly been wiped out. The last case dates to 1978 when medical photographer Janet Parker contracted smallpox at the University of Birmingham Medical School. She died on September 11, 1978. How she became infected remains unknown. However, it was determined the source was a variola virus grown for research purposes at the medical school lab. The virus is still kept in 2 laboratories, one in the United States, the other in Russia. However, it has been proven that sources for disease can be found outside of laboratories. On March 31, 2003, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, inside an 1888 book on Civil War medical practices, smallpox scabs were found inside an envelope. They were turned over to the CDC. In July 2014, 6 sealed glass vials of smallpox dating back to 1954, along with vials of pathogens, were found in a cold storage room in an FDA lab in Maryland. These were turned over to the CDC, which found that at least 2 vials had samples that were viable in culture. In 2017, an extinct horsepox virus of the variola virus was recreated at the University of Alberta. This proved that a virus can be recreated even if samples are destroyed. This calls into question dual-use research. According to Dr. Stephen Rydell from Baylor University Medical Center, quote, given the presence and availability of plague around the world, the capacity for mass production and aerosol dissemination, the high fatality rate of pneumonic plague, and the potential for rapid secondary spread, the potential use of plague as a biological weapon is of great concern. End quote. Cholera is a disease that causes deadly gastrointestinal complications in humans and would have to be added to major water sources in order to affect large amounts of the population. Another deadly infectious disease is tularemia, which only needs less than 10 organisms to enter the body before causing infection. It produces fever, ulcerations, swelling of the lymph glands, and in some cases pneumonia. It is hardy, can stay active in decaying carcasses, moist soils, cold water, and hay for many weeks. Symptoms will show up 3 to 5 days after infection, and without antibiotic treatment, it can lead quickly to respiratory failure and death. These are only a few of the pathogens that can be used as biological weapons. Even though disease has been used to conquer enemies for hundreds of years, in modern times we face the potential of a gene editing technology known as CRISPR. It can edit genomes and modify DNA sequences to alter gene function. It can be used to correct genetic defects, but in the wrong hands, can be used as a weapon of mass destruction. It could be used to create drug-resistant strains of disease or insects that are not exterminated by pesticides and can wipe out a country's staple crop. Very interesting. And I remember back in 2001, this thing with the anthrax scare, because 2001, that was a year that's difficult to forget because we had 9/11. We had this thing with the anthrax scare, and talk about, that was a difficult year, because I want to say a lot of people, myself included, had experiences that we could never have anticipated or imagined or ever thought that we would witness. How's that? And there you go. All right. Next story is out of Mysterious Universe and is titled The Mysterious Monster of Loch Morar. When it comes to lake monsters, by far the rock star is the Loch Ness Monster of Scotland's Loch Ness. However, this is not the only loch in the country said to harbor its own monster. And here we'll look at Nessie's lesser known sibling. Lying out in the rough bounds of Lochaber, Highland Scotland, is Loch Morar. While not quite as famous as its cousin Loch Ness, it is still quite the body of water, being the fifth largest loch by surface area in Scotland at 10.3 square miles, and the deepest freshwater body in the British Isles with a maximum depth of 1,017 feet, making it even deeper than Loch Ness. Like much of the area, the lake is steeped in history and folklore, and much like its more well-known cousin, the loch is said to be home to a mysterious creature that has so far managed to elude science. Folklore about something strange in the loch goes all the way back to the 19th century, when the creature was often described less like the lake monster and has become and more like what one might liken to a mermaid. At the time, Morag, as a creature has come to be known, was thought to be a water spirit in the form of a half-fish, half-human woman with flowing hair that prowled the depths of the loch looking for trouble. She was not seen as something anyone wanted to encounter, as she was thought to be an omen of impending death. Alexander Carmichael, a prolific gatherer of folklore at the turn of the last century, has gathered a plethora of early stories about her from people living near the loch, and says of this folkloric version of Morag, quote, Morag is always seen before a death and before a drowning. There is a creature in Loch Morar, and she is called Morag. She is never seen save when one of the hereditary people of the place dies. The last time she was seen was when Anus MacDonald died in 1898. The Morag is peculiar to Loch Morar. She is seen in broad daylight and by many persons, including charged persons. She appears in a black heap or ball, slowly and deliberately rising in the water and moving along like a boat waterlogged. The Morag is much disliked and is called by many uncomplimentary terms. Great distress, like the other water deities, she is half human, half fish. The lower portions of her body is in the form of a grilse, and the upper in the form of a small woman of highly developed breast with long, flowing yellow hair falling down her snow-white back and breast. She is represented as being fair, beautiful, and very timid, and never seen save when one of the Morar family dies, or when the clan falls in battle. Then she is seen rushing about with great speed, and is heard wailing in great distress, bemoaning and weeping the loss of the house of Morar, laid desolate. The Morag has often been brought out of their houses at night, the people living along the shores of the lake and in the neighborhood of her haunts, causing much anxiety to the men and women, sore weeping to the men and much more sore weeping to the women. End quote. However, as much as this sounds like pure fantasy and legend, there were apparently many people witnessing strange dark shapes in the loch since at least 1867, when a Father Alan MacDonald wrote in his journals that there were many eyewitnesses of a monster in Loch Morar. The creature was usually described as a large dark mass, sometimes serpentine in shape and sometimes more amorphous, usually lurking just beneath the waves and moving at a slow rate. Apparently, by the early 20th century, people of all walks of life and those of good standing were seeing this thing. And an excerpt from William T. Kilgore's unwieldy titled Lochaber in War and Peace, being a record of historical incidents, legends, traditions, and folklore, with notes on the topography and scenic beauties of the whole district, says of the creature. Talk about a long title. Anyway, quote, Morar Loch, the deepest lake in the Three Kingdoms, has gained the reputation of harboring a monster so mysterious and uncanny that the dwellers in these parts live in perpetual terror of it. Morag, as the apparition has been christened, is said to have been seen by a number of persons of unquestionable veracity. One of them is, when recounting his experience, alleges that early on a summer morn, when rowing across the loch, he happened on nearing the further shore to catch sight of Morag. a huge shapeless dark mass rising out of the water like an island. It suddenly disappeared, and the disturbance of the water sent a ripple towards his boat, which caused it to roll slightly. The belief is prevalent among the residents by the lake that the sea monster in Loch Morar never rises save when some MacDonald or Gillies is about to exchange the barren hills of Morar for a fairer and more salubrious clime. End quote. It would not be until the mid-20th century that reports like this would start hitting the mainstream, partly because of the remoteness of Loch Morar in comparison with its more heavily populated and visited sibling Loch Ness. One of the first news reports to come out about a monster in Loch Morar hit the press in 1948 when 9 people out on the loch in a boat claimed to see a serpent-like creature that they approximated was 20 feet long on the loch. A report on the sighting in the Pittsburgh Press reads, quote, Glasgow, it's back, folks, the monster of the Scotch lakes. A party of 9 on Loch Morar, deepest lake in Scotland, called the attention of boatman John Gillies to an unusual object a quarter of a mile away. Through my binoculars, says Gillies, it appeared about 20 feet long and had prominent humps. Neither head nor tail was visible. End quote. In 1968, a barman from the Morar Hotel by the name of John McCarvish was boating on the loch when he allegedly saw a black, smooth-skinned creature swimming across the water with its neck extended 5 or 6 feet out of the water, topped with a small, flattish, snake-like head. He would say of his sighting, quote, I saw this thing coming. I thought it was a man standing in a boat, but as I got nearer, I saw it was something coming out of the water. I tried to get up close to it with the outboard out of the water, and what I saw was a long neck, 5 or 6 feet out of the water with a small head on it, dark in color, coming quite slowly down the loch. When I got to about 300 yards of it, it turned off into the deep and just settled down slowly into the loch out of sight. The neck was about 1.5 feet in diameter and tapered up to between 10 inches and a foot. I never saw any features, no eyes or anything like that. It was a snake-like head, very small compared to the size of the neck, flattish, a flat type of head. It seemed to have very smooth skin, but at 300 yards it's difficult to tell. It was very dark, nearly black. It was 10 a.m., dead calm, no wind, brilliant sunshine. I saw it for about 10 minutes, traveling very slowly. It didn't alter its angle to the water. It looked as if it was paddling itself along. There was very little movement from the water, just a small streak from the neck. I couldn't really see what was propelling it, but I think it was something at the sides rather than behind it. End quote. A rather famous report came out the following year. In 1969, concerning 2 local men by the names of William Simpson and Duncan MacDonald. The 2 men had been out fishing at the loch when they heard a splash behind them and saw something moving at great speed towards their boat. Simpson would say of what happened, quote, As we were sailing down the loch in my boat, we were suddenly disturbed and frightened by a thing that surfaced behind us. We watched it catch us up, then bump into the side of the boat. The impact sent a kettle of water I was heating onto the floor. I ran into the cabin to turn the gas off, as the water had put the flame out. Then I came out of the cabin to see my mate trying to fend the beast off with an oar. To me, he was wasting his time. Then when I seen the oar break, I grabbed my rifle and quickly, putting a bullet in it, fired in the direction of the beast. Then I watched it slowly sink away from the boat, and that was the last seen of it. There is no doubt in my mind that there is a large monster, maybe more than one, in Loch Morar. End quote. That same year, an unnamed fisherman in Mobile Bay saw a monster lizard just lying on the bottom in about 12 feet of crystal clear water. It was described as being about 20 feet long and gray-brown in color with a snake-like head and 4 legs with 3 toes on each foot. That same year, there was another amazing encounter that was related to the blog Loch Ness Mystery by a witness named Tricia, who says her experience occurred sometime in the last week of August of 1969. The witness says her and her family spent a lot of holidays out at Loch Morar, where they rented a cottage by the beach. This strange experience took place as she was out fishing one day with her father and siblings, and she describes what happened as follows. Quote, We traveled for what seemed like hours to us on a small boat with an outboard motor and two oars on the lock. My memories of this journey are very clear. I was intrigued with the scenery and how we were in such a remote, mystical area. I wondered how people got to the few houses I saw at both sides of the lock. I do remember one very large house sitting in the trees to my right on our way down the lock and wondering what type of folks lived there. After what seemed like a long time, we decided to stop at a shingle cove on the left as we traveled down the lock. We had lunch and Dad and my brothers fished from the side of the lock. I can tell you that my dad on these fishing expeditions lost all sense of time and indeed would walk away from us and forget we even existed. On this particular occasion, my mischievous brother untied the empty boat and I quickly retrieved it, tearing my toenail off on a rock for my good deed. One of the oars fell from the boat and floated out before I could retrieve it. Eventually my dad returned. I reckon this was about 5 p.m. I remember while we were on the shingle beach, a fishing boat went past us, and we waved to the folks on board. After a while, the same boat passed us on their way back, and we waved again. We packed up and started off back up the lock to return home. My dad was a very calm and placid man, but on this occasion, he was upset with my brother regarding the one lost oar. 10 minutes or so into the journey, at which point we were in the middle of the lock, and to my recollection, both shores were equidistant, the outboard motor packed in. We as kids were not particularly concerned with this because we were used to this type of event. My father regularly took us on fishing expeditions to many other locks, seas, and rivers where outboard motors would pack in and be fixed by him. As we sat patiently while he worked on this motor, I looked to my right and spotted 2 or 3 protrusions from the water, about 2 feet high. I thought these were rocks at first, but I remember having a feeling of unexplained fear. I turned to my sister, who was sitting next to me, and said, "Look over there, what is that?" At which point my dad said, "Shut up, Patricia," with gritted teeth. This was upsetting to me as my dad was very rarely angry at us kids, and we were taught all our lives never to say "shut up" to anybody. This was a golden rule in our house. My dad had of course spotted the same protrusions and kept this to himself. I and my sister stared at the sight in the water in confused wonderment. My brothers at this point were oblivious down to their age and preoccupation with trying to untangle the fishing tackle which my dad had tasked them with. I said again, "Dad, what is that in the water?" To which he replied again, "Shut up," in an angry voice. This prompted my brothers to look over and join in the debate. The feeling of fear was now with us all. Some time later my dad explained to us his mind was not only on trying to fix the motor, but also trying to figure out how he could get us to shore safely away from this unexplained thing in the water. I'm smiling as I write this, but also empathizing with his thoughts. He must have been frantic. He did, however, on the outside remain calm for our sake. The upshot is he finally got the motor going. As we started to travel, the mysterious protrusions, which had stayed with us for the duration of time it had taken Dad to fix the motor in the same position, disappeared below the water, leaving a slight swell which we felt in the boat. We trundled along again for which felt like hours till we reached the jetty where we had started out from. On landing there was a flurry of activity, and our mom was crying and very agitated. She of course was witness to 2 fishermen relaying to a crowd of folks, including reporters, their experience on the lock that same day some hours before. From my recollection, they also had an up-close and personal experience with, I presume, the same thing we had witnessed. They, however, said this thing had hit their boat and they hit back with an oar and a gunshot. As we landed, there was a boat with folks on board ready to launch to come and look for us. My dad apologized and profusely to these folks. He told us kids not to say a word about our sighting, as he explained later. He did not want it to be seen we were jumping on the 2 fishermen's bandwagon, but also he did not want people thinking we were nuts. We are an ordinary family with nothing to gain from me telling our story. Between us, we are business folks, professional managers, and a social worker. My mom is retired from the police force, and my dad was a hard-working, self-employed electrician. End quote. Very strange indeed. In 1971, a local resident by the name of Eden Gillies was out at his cottage on the shores of the loch when he noticed a huge creature in the water about half a mile from his home. It was described as being black in color with a long neck, small head, and 2 or 3 humps. A few years later, in 1975, two brothers on a birdwatching expedition were driving in the area where the Morar River flows out of the loch into the ocean barely a mile away, when one of them saw what he described as a 20-foot-long creature with a snake-like head, smooth brown skin, and powerful hindquarters rise from a shallow pool of water and plunge into the loch. In 1977, the first real evidence of the creature came forward in the form of a pair of photographs taken by Miss M. Lindsay. While pretty inconclusive, they show a dark mass that seems to change position from one image to the next, and the second photo seems to show 2 humps. By now, excitement of the creature was so high that the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau had expanded its search to include Loch Morar, with several high-profile expeditions embarking to capture evidence of the monster without luck. In 2013, there was a flurry of sightings of Morag. In one, Alistair McKellig was out fishing with friends when they all saw Morag from a distance of only about 50 feet, describing the creature as a classic 3 humps moving through the water with the head underwater. That same year, a couple having a picnic in front of Swordsland Lodge on the banks of Loch Morar saw something large zigzagging in the water near the shore in Mobile Bay. Perhaps the most well-known 2013 sighting was made by tourists Doug and Charlotte Christie, who were staying in a B&B on the shores of the loch on holiday. They would say they saw the beast 3 times during a stay at the Kisimuli B&B by the loch. Charlotte would explain the experience, quote, "I could not believe my eyes. I am not the type to get excited unduly, but this just couldn't be explained. It was a large black shape on the loch that looked just like a bit of submarine and around the same size. I thought it was a whale. We saw it 3 times in the space of 2 days. The longest sighting was about 10 minutes before it submerged again. Doug shouted to me, asking if there was a rock out in the middle of the loch. I laughed and shouted back that the loch was almost 1,000 feet deep, and there were no rocks near the surface. But sure enough, there was a largest black object, maybe 2, very close together in the middle of the 2-mile-wide loch. I've seen otters in the loch, but this was no otter, much bigger and almost motionless." End quote. The owners of the B&B where the Christies were staying, Michael and Catherine McNeil, also witnessed one of the Christie sightings. There is also the sighting of 58-year-old factory boss Alistair McKellig of Mallig, Inverness Shire, who says, quote, "I was fishing with a group in a boat, and we all saw Morag, and only about 50 yards away. It was a classic 3 humps, moving through the water with a head underwater. We were left astounded and a wee bit fearful at what we had seen, and how close we had been to it. I bumped into Michael the other day, and firmly believe that what he, his daughter, and guests saw was what we witnessed, but they saw Morag at a far greater distance than we did. I'm sure others have seen Morag in the past 23 years, but felt too embarrassed to say so." End quote. That same year, there was yet another encounter with Morag, this time by a Scott Justice of East Kilbride, who said, quote, "It was at 1:45 p.m. My wife and I were both sitting on the front of Swordsland Lodge at Loch Morar, having a picnic, having walked the 5 miles or so, having parked the car at the end of the road at Bracora, when my wife spotted something in the water near the shore at Mobile Bay. It zigzagged for a couple of minutes near the shoreline before disappearing. It just suddenly seemed to appear. It was too far away, unfortunately, to see it clearly enough. I wish I had taken a better camera or even my binoculars to get a better view. We watched the water for another 20 minutes or so, but didn't see anything else unusual." End quote. He managed to get a photo of the creature. As recently as 2019, Loch Morar Superintendent Viv DeFresnes saw 2 large unknown shapes crossing the loch in the summer of 2019, showing that the creature is still lurking about out there. However, compared to the more famous Loch Ness Monster, there are relatively few sightings of Morag. This is most likely because Loch Morar, despite only being 70 miles from its more well-known sister, is comparably sparsely populated and remote, with the southern side and about 1/3 of the northern side accessible only by foot or by boat, or in some places by bicycle. Yet despite its more low-profile, Morag seems worth noting when looking at monsters in the lochs of Scotland. Interestingly, there are also supposedly monsters lurking in Loch Lochy, Loch Arkaig, Loch Oik, or Oich, I'm not sure, Loch Lynn, Loch Keosh, and Loch Shiel, although Nessie is by far the most famous of all. There's been lots of speculation on what Morag can be, just like with the Loch Ness Monster. From giant eels to prehistoric monsters, or merely logs, waves, and other misidentified mundane phenomena, the theories really run the gamut. Whatever it is, Morag still remains at large, and while not as famous as its not Loch Ness sibling, it still manages to generate intrigue and speculation to this day. I never knew. Everybody hears about Loch Ness. I had never heard of this Loch Morag, much less that it seems that they have a sea serpent or whatever it is in every loch. Okay, I love it. There's new Eerie news and old Eerie news that you've never heard about. So, yeah, I will be back with you soon. Till next time, take care.